On August 5, 1532, 120,000 Ottoman warriors stopped before the walls of a fortress they planned to take in 2 days. 25 days later, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent would turn that army around and leave with nothing. 700 defenders without artillery would derail the march on Vienna and change the fate of Europe. This is the story of how a handful of men stopped an empire. In the spring of 1532, Suleiman I assembled the most powerful army the Christian world had ever seen. Between 80,000 and 120,000 men, janissaries, sipahis, cavalry from Anatolia and Rumelia, hundreds of artillery pieces, engineering corps. The goal was crystal clear: drive the Austrians out of Hungary once and for all, capture Vienna, finish the job that failed in 1529. 3 years earlier, the siege of the Austrian capital collapsed because of weather and haste. Now the Sultan moved slowly, methodically, with massive resources and iron determination. This was meant to be the campaign that would bring the Habsburgs to their knees and open the Ottoman path into the heart of Europe. The Ottoman war machine in 1532 was the most advanced military organization of its era. Janissaries formed the backbone, elite infantry units recruited through the Dev-Shirme system, trained from childhood in warfare, disciplined to the point of fanaticism. These were not ordinary soldiers. They lived and died for the Sultan. Their loyalty was absolute. Their training was brutal. Their effectiveness in battle was legendary across 3 continents. Behind them came the Sipahi cavalry, feudal horsemen who held land grants in exchange for military service, equipped with the finest armor and weapons Ottoman wealth could provide. Then, the Anatolian irregulars, the Rumelian auxiliaries, the Tartar light cavalry from the steppes, artillery trains stretched for miles, massive bronze cannons that could level castle walls, medium guns for field battles, small falconets for close support, engineers who could build bridges across rivers in days, dig mines under fortress walls, construct siege towers that reached the heavens, supply trains that fed this colossal organism, thousands of camels and wagons carrying grain, gunpowder, cannonballs, arrows, tents, fodder. Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire understood the threat perfectly. He sent his brother Ferdinand I serious reinforcements, tens of thousands of German Landsknechts, Spanish infantry famous from the Italian wars, Italian mercenaries who had fought in every conflict from Naples to Milan. A large army took position between Vienna and Wiener Neustadt, ready for the decisive battle. Charles himself commanded vast resources, the wealth of Spain and its New World colonies, the military traditions of Burgundy, the imperial prestige of Germany, the tactical innovations of the Italian campaigns. His army represented the best Europe could field: pike squares that could stop cavalry charges, arquebusiers whose volleys could shatter infantry formations, artillery that matched Ottoman bronze cannon for cannon. The stage was set for one of history's great confrontations. Europe held its breath, waiting for the grand collision of 2 empires. Ottoman might against Christian resistance, East versus West, Crescent against Cross, the battle that should have decided the fate of the continent for generations. Diplomats frantically wrote dispatches, merchants calculated the economic consequences, common people prayed in churches and mosques. The outcome would determine whether Vienna fell, whether Austria survived, whether the Ottoman tide would sweep into Germany and beyond. Military theorists predicted devastation. When armies of this size met in open battle, casualties numbered in tens of thousands. The bloody fields of Mohacs in 1526 were still fresh in memory, where Hungarian power died in a single afternoon and 20,000 Christians perished. Would Vienna's surroundings witness similar carnage? But that battle never happened. It was derailed by a small fortress on the Hungarian border that most Europeans did not even know existed. History loves these ironies. Great plans collapse because of small obstacles. Massive armies stumble over tiny stones. And on August 5, 1532, the greatest military machine the world had seen in generations met its tiny stone. On August 5, 1532, the Ottoman column approached the town of Kőszeg, in German, Günz. This was a small border fortress not far from the Austrian frontier, a fortified point on a secondary road, a third-rate fort by any military standard. The walls dated from medieval times, built when siege warfare meant ladders and battering rams, not gunpowder artillery that could punch through stone like paper. The town itself was unremarkable. A market center, some craft workshops, a few hundred houses clustered around a modest castle. Strategic value, minimal. The road it guarded was not the main invasion route. Bypassing it would cost perhaps an extra day's march. Military garrison, laughable by contemporary standards. The Sultan did not even consider it necessary to personally direct the siege. The task was assigned to Grand Vizier Pargala Ibrahim Pasha, the empire's most talented commander, the man who had conquered half the Mediterranean for Suleiman. Ibrahim Pasha was no ordinary general. He was Suleiman's closest friend, his most trusted advisor, his Grand Vizier, who wielded power second only to the Sultan himself. Greek by birth, taken as a slave in childhood, educated in the palace, he rose through brilliance and ruthlessness to the summit of Ottoman power. He had commanded the conquest of Egypt. He had negotiated treaties with Venice and France. He had personally led armies that crushed Christian coalitions. Rhodes fell before his strategic genius after a 6-month siege that broke the Knights Hospitaller. Belgrade, considered impregnable, capitulated when Ibrahim applied relentless pressure and masterful diplomacy. If Ibrahim Pasha commanded the Siege of Kőszeg, the outcome seemed inevitable. The calculation was elementary. A couple of assaults, a breach in the walls, slaughter, then onward to Vienna. 2 days maximum. Perhaps the defenders would surrender at the sight of the Ottoman army without a single shot. Dozens of fortresses had done exactly that when faced with the inevitable. Why waste lives fighting when defeat was certain? Garrisons across Hungary had opened their gates and saved themselves when Ottoman columns appeared. Smart commanders negotiated terms, lives spared, property protected in exchange for peaceful submission. The Ottomans were pragmatic conquerors. Resistance meant death. Surrender meant survival. The choice was obvious. Kőszeg would make the obvious choice, or so Ibrahim Pasha thought, but Kőszeg turned out to be different. The garrison of the fortress numbered only about 700 to 800 men. In military terms, this was nothing. A reinforced company in modern terms, a single battalion split into thirds. Against 120,000 Ottomans, the ratio was roughly 1 to 150. Mathematical annihilation. Defense was commanded by Croatian nobleman Nikola Jurišić, an experienced military man, veteran of border wars, a man of steel will and cold calculation. Jurišić was 47 years old, weathered by decades of frontier warfare, familiar with Ottoman tactics from countless skirmishes. He knew Turkish military organization. He spoke their language. He understood their strengths and their weaknesses. He had fought them in small raids, night attacks, desperate defenses of isolated outposts. He knew what happened to garrisons that surrendered. Sometimes mercy, often slavery, occasionally massacre, depending on Ottoman mood and needs. Of these 700, professional soldiers were few. A couple dozen knights with proper armor and training, 100 or so mercenaries who fought for pay, men who had seen campaigns in Italy or Germany or previous Hungarian wars. The rest were local residents, craftsmen, peasants, refugees from surrounding villages who had taken shelter behind the walls from the Ottoman invasion, blacksmiths who could swing hammers, carpenters who understood construction, farmers who knew how to use hunting bows and farm implements, men capable of bearing arms, women and children ready to help, old men who remembered previous Turkish raids and knew exactly what Ottoman conquest meant, burned villages, enslaved families, destroyed livelihoods. Nobody believed they would last even a day against the greatest military machine in the world. The math was too brutal, the disparity too overwhelming. The Ottomans had taken Constantinople itself, the queen of cities, protected by triple walls that had stood for 1,000 years. They had conquered Belgrade, fortress of fortresses, guardian of the Danube. They had crushed Rhodes, defended by the finest military order of Christendom. What chance did a third-rate Hungarian border fort have against such power? But these people had no choice. If the Turks entered the city, they faced slaughter or slavery. There was nowhere to run. The Ottoman army controlled the countryside for miles around. Fleeing meant being hunted down by Tartar cavalry or Turkish light horsemen who rode down refugees like wolves running down sheep. Staying meant fighting. The only question was, fight and die quickly, or fight and die slowly? Jurišić gave them a third option: fight and possibly survive. Not probable, but possible. If they could hold long enough, if they could inflict enough casualties, if they could buy enough time, if Vienna could be saved, if the campaign could be delayed, if, long odds, desperate odds, but odds nonetheless. The defenders had no artillery, not a single cannon. This was crippling. Artillery was the queen of 16th century warfare. Fortresses without cannon could not suppress enemy artillery, could not contest breaches, could not provide covering fire for defenders. Kőszeg had nothing. Only handheld firearms, arquebuses, primitive matchlock weapons that fired heavy lead balls with reasonable accuracy at close range, but required lengthy reloading. Muskets, slightly more advanced but still cumbersome. Crossbows, medieval weapons increasingly obsolete, but still deadly in trained hands. Regular bows, which demanded years of practice but could maintain higher rates of fire. Spears, swords, axes, hammers, tools of close combat. The walls of Kőszeg were low, old, built back in the 14th century when artillery played no decisive role in warfare. Medieval architects designed walls to resist scaling ladders, battering rams, siege towers, not cannonballs traveling at hundreds of feet per second with kinetic energy that shattered stone like pottery. The fortress had never been modernized for the new era of gunpowder warfare. No trace Italian fortifications with angled bastions that deflected shot. No thick earth ramparts that absorbed cannon impacts. No modern gun platforms for defensive artillery. Just old-fashioned vertical stone walls, maybe 20 feet high in places, with medieval towers that stuck up like targets begging to be knocked down. Shallow moats that could be filled with fascines in hours. Weak gates that could be blown apart with mine charges. Against 16th century Ottoman siege weapons, this was like cardboard scenery. Jurišić understood perfectly the hopelessness of the situation. He was not delusional. He knew military reality. One serious bombardment would open multiple breaches. One determined assault would overwhelm his tiny garrison. The Ottomans had siegecraft refined over centuries of conquest. They had books on how to reduce fortresses, manuals passed down from generation to generation, knowledge accumulated from hundreds of successful sieges. They knew how to dig approach trenches, how to position artillery for maximum effect, how to coordinate assaults from multiple directions, how to use mines and countermines, how to maintain siege lines and prevent relief forces from breaking through. But Jurišić also understood the strategic reality. Every day the Turks spent under Kőszeg was a day won for Vienna. This was the key insight. The Ottomans were not fighting a local battle. They were fighting a campaign with strategic objectives and time constraints. Autumn approached. Weather would turn. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles. Every day wasted was a day Emperor Charles used to strengthen Vienna's defenses, concentrate troops, position artillery, stockpile supplies. Every hour of delay reduced Ottoman chances of taking the Austrian capital before winter, made campaigning impossible. Military logistics dictated everything. Armies marched on their stomachs. Gunpowder had to come from magazines. Horses needed forage. Soldiers needed pay. The longer the campaign dragged, the more expensive it became, the more fragile the supply system, the more vulnerable the army to disease and desertion. And the Croatian nobleman decided to sell every meter of wall as dearly as possible, to turn his pathetic fortress into a trap that would devour the precious time of the world's greatest empire. This was his mission. Not to defeat the Ottomans, impossible. Not to drive them back, absurd. Simply to delay them, to cost them time, to transform Kőszeg from an irrelevant obstacle into a strategic sinkhole that consumed days and weeks, to become the stone that broke the wheel. He explained this to his men. They understood. They accepted. What choice did they have? Run and die on the roads, surrender and hope for mercy? Or fight and at least die with purpose, knowing their deaths bought something valuable? Time for their families in Vienna, time for Europe, time for Christianity. It was not much of a choice, but it was something. The siege began either on August 5th or 9th. Sources disagree on dates, as chroniclers in wartime often recorded events days after they occurred. Memory failed. Calendars differed between Julian and Gregorian reckonings. Regardless, early August saw Ottoman forces invest Kőszeg completely. The Ottomans had overwhelming numerical superiority, roughly 1 to 150 or even more, depending on how many of the main army's camp followers and auxiliaries participated. They had powerful artillery, dozens of guns including heavy bombards that fired stone or iron balls weighing 100 pounds or more, medium cannon that could batter walls methodically, light guns for anti-personnel work, siege towers for assaulting high fortifications, tall wooden structures on wheels that could be pushed against walls, allowing attackers to climb directly onto the ramparts and fight the defenders on equal footing. Mobile shields called mantlets that protected sappers and miners. Engineering equipment for digging approach trenches, filling moats, undermining foundations, the entire technological arsenal of the 16th century, honed through dozens of successful sieges from Belgrade to Rhodes to Egypt. Grand Vizier Pargalı, Ibrahim Pasha, had no doubt about quick victory. He had taken stronger fortresses than this pathetic border post. Rhodes had lasted 6 months because the Knights Hospitaller were professional warriors with massive fortifications and fanatical determination. Belgrade fell after complex siege operations because its walls were modern and its garrison experienced. Kőszeg was neither. It was an obsolete medieval fort with a scratch garrison of civilians, 2 days, 3 maximum, then Vienna. Ibrahim Pasha scheduled the first assault for the day after the army's arrival. Why waste time on formalities? Turkish artillery opened fire at dawn. The bombardment began systematically. Ottoman gunners were professionals who understood their craft. They positioned batteries to create crossfire, to hit wall sections from multiple angles, to concentrate force on selected points. Cannonballs weighing hundreds of pounds smashed into the stonework, knocking out entire blocks, creating cracks that spiderwebbed through masonry, splitting towers. The roar was deafening, continuous thunder that made conversation impossible, that rattled teeth and shook internal organs, that terrified animals and unnerved even experienced soldiers. As if the earth itself was splitting apart. Smoke from dozens of guns created artificial fog that drifted across the battlefield. The chemical stink of gunpowder, sulfur, charcoal, saltpeter, filled nostrils and burned lungs. Defenders hid behind whatever cover they could find, knowing they had nothing to answer with, that this was one-sided butchery of stone and metal. They crouched behind intact wall sections. They sheltered in tower bases. They pressed themselves into corners and prayed cannonballs would miss. Some did. Most did not. Men died from flying stone fragments as deadly as the cannonballs themselves. Ricochets bounced unpredictably, crushing skulls and breaking bones. The psychological impact was enormous, sitting helpless while the enemy systematically destroyed your defenses, unable to fight back, unable to stop the inevitable. After several hours of continuous bombardment, a breach several meters wide opened in the southern wall, enough to let attackers through in dense columns. This was the moment. Ottoman infantry launched the first assault. Hundreds of janissaries, the empire's elite warriors, armed with swords, shields, and fanatic confidence in victory, rushed toward the breach under drumbeats and war cries. They came in waves, densely packed, roaring battle cries, convinced that numbers and courage would overwhelm the pathetic defense. This was the first of 19 assaults that would stretch over 25 days and turn Kőszeg into legend. The defenders met the attackers with point-blank arquebus volleys, smoke, thunder, whistling bullets. Jurišić had positioned his best shooters at the breach, told them to hold fire until the enemy was close, then unleash maximum firepower at minimum range. Front ranks of janissaries fell, chests torn open by heavy lead balls, skulls shattered, limbs broken. But rear ranks pressed forward, stepping over the bodies of comrades, trained to ignore casualties, to maintain momentum, to overwhelm resistance through sheer numbers and determination. This was Janissary doctrine, relentless forward pressure, contempt for death, absolute discipline. Hand-to-hand combat began in the breach, swords against spears, shields against axes, fury against desperation. The fighting was savage, intimate, personal. Men stabbed and hacked at arm's length. Blood sprayed, men screamed, bodies piled up in the narrow breach, creating obstacles that impeded both sides. Local residents, yesterday's craftsmen and farmers, fought with the desperation of the doomed, knowing that behind their backs were wives and children, that there was nowhere to retreat, that this was the last line between life and slavery. A blacksmith wielded his hammer with the same skill he used on iron, crushing Turkish helmets like metal caps. A carpenter used his axe to deadly effect, chopping at exposed limbs and necks. A farmer's son, barely 16, thrust his spear again and again into the press of attackers until a janissary's sword found his throat. The young died beside the old. Professionals fell next to amateurs. Blood made the footing treacherous. The breach became a charnel house where men killed each other with primitive brutality. Women hauled stones and timbers to patch the breach while men held the line. They worked in the shadow of death, exposed to stray arrows and bullets, dragging heavy materials under fire. Children carried ammunition, water, medical supplies. 10-year-olds ran through smoke and chaos, bringing leather pouches of gunpowder and lead balls to reloading stations, carrying wine or water to men parched from fighting and fear. Old men poured boiling tar from intact sections of walls onto the heads of attackers. They heated cauldrons over fires, lifted them with poles and chains, tipped them over the ramparts. Turkish soldiers screamed as superheated liquid burned through clothing and flesh. Screams of the wounded, clang of metal on metal, smell of blood and gunpowder and burning flesh and human waste as men's bowels loosened in death. Jurišić personally commanded the defense at the hottest points, running from tower to tower, plugging holes in the line with men and materials. He was everywhere at once, or so it seemed to the defenders. When janissaries broke through on the eastern section, Jurišić led the counterattack personally, sword in hand, rallying men who were ready to run. When western defenses wavered under artillery fire, he appeared with reinforcements and encouraging words. When ammunition ran low in a forward position, he organized supply lines. He seemed immortal, untouchable, blessed by God. Men followed him because he showed no fear, because he asked nothing he would not do himself, because his presence meant courage flowed from commander to commanded. His personal example kept defenders' morale at the edge of impossibility. They repelled the first assault at the cost of dozens killed and wounded, nearly 10% of the garrison in one day. At such rates of loss, the fortress would not hold even a week. Simple mathematics. 700 men losing 70 per day meant 10 days maximum before combat effectiveness collapsed. Probably less, because wounded often could not return to duty, and exhaustion compounded losses faster than arithmetic predicted. But the Turks retreated, leaving hundreds of their dead under the walls. And this mattered. The Ottomans were used to easy victories, to fortresses falling after the first serious blow, to defenders losing nerve when reality of Ottoman power became undeniable. Kőszeg did not fall, did not lose nerve, did not collapse into panic and surrender. This was a psychological blow to the attackers' confidence. The next day, artillery opened fire again, widening breaches, creating new gaps in the crumbling walls. Ottoman gunners adjusted their aim, concentrated fire on already weakened sections, systematically demolished towers that still provided defensive positions. The Ottomans attacked from two directions simultaneously, trying to stretch the defenders thin, force them to divide forces, create multiple crisis points that would overwhelm Jurišić's ability to respond. This was sound tactics, classic siege doctrine: apply pressure everywhere, find the weak point, exploit it, break through. But Jurišić had anticipated this. He organized mobile groups, small detachments of 20 to 30 men who were thrown wherever pressure was strongest. This was tactic of patching holes, working at the limit of human capability. These mobile reserves never rested. They ran from crisis to crisis, fighting, then running again, fighting again, an endless cycle of desperation. Men operated on adrenaline and terror, knowing that stopping meant death for everyone. Every breach was filled with whatever came to hand: timbers from dismantled houses, stones from collapsed walls, sandbags hastily sown and filled with earth, rubble from destroyed buildings, furniture, cartwheels, barrels, even corpses of fallen defenders when nothing else remained. The walls turned into monstrous piles of debris held together by blood and desperation. grotesque patchworks that somehow held against renewed assaults. Medieval fortifications transformed into something alien, lumpy, irregular, improvised barriers that looked nothing like proper military engineering, but somehow functioned. But the line held. Day after day, assault after assault, Kőszeg stood, and the Ottoman army lost the most precious thing: time. Grand Vizier Pargalı Ibrahim Pasha could not believe what was happening. The world's greatest military machine was stuck under the walls of a third-rate fortress defended by a handful of peasants and craftsmen. This violated all military logic. It contradicted Ottoman experience. It made no sense. How could professionals fail where amateurs succeeded? How could overwhelming force be thwarted by numbers that barely constituted a proper garrison? Ibrahim Pasha paced his tent at night, calculating, recalculating, trying to understand what had gone wrong. The math should work. Numbers should tell. Technology should dominate. But something was wrong with the equation. This was not just military failure. It was an insult to the empire's honor, fate's mockery, a blow to the sultan's prestige. Ottoman losses grew with each day. Each assault cost dozens, if not hundreds, of lives. Janissaries, the elite of the Turkish army, the finest warriors of the East, died in the breaches at the hands of yesterday's farmers. These were not supposed to be soldiers. They had no training, no military tradition, no esprit de corps. Yet they fought like demons. Artillery fired thousands of cannonballs, consuming precious gunpowder at rates that alarmed the supply officers. But each new breach was patched by morning through some miracle of stubbornness and will. The Ottomans began digging tunnels under the walls to collapse them with gunpowder explosions, classic 16th century siege tactics that had worked at countless fortresses. Sappers dug approach tunnels from protected positions, extended them toward the foundations, packed chambers with barrels of gunpowder, then ignited fuses and ran. Defenders dug counter-tunnels and fought underground battles in pitch darkness, where you cannot see the enemy's face, where men fight blind by feel, with knives and short swords in the tightness of earth tunnels. Some miners were buried alive when tunnels collapsed. Others died from methane gas that accumulated in poorly ventilated shafts. Others fought and killed in blackness, where friend and foe were indistinguishable. Kőszeg turned into a meat grinder, where the honor of a great empire was being pulverized into crumbs by human will to survive. Days added up to weeks. August 10th, 15th, 20th. The Ottoman army stood in place before a miserable town. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, personally observing the siege from his luxurious tent a mile from the fortress, was furious. Every day under Kőszeg was a day during which Emperor Charles V strengthened Vienna and concentrated troops at the capital. Intelligence reports confirmed the worst. The Habsburgs were using the delay brilliantly. Troops marched from across the empire toward Vienna. Fortifications were improved, supply magazines filled, artillery positioned. The entire defensive system strengthened day by day, while the Ottomans wasted time on irrelevant Kőszeg. Every hour of delay reduced chances for success of the entire campaign, for achieving that great goal for which this army had been assembled, for delivering the decisive blow that would break Habsburg power forever. Weather began to turn bad. Autumn approached. First rains turned roads into muddy mess. Logistics of a huge army of 120,000 men required constant supply of food, forage, ammunition. Ottoman supply trains stretched hundreds of miles from Constantinople to the Hungarian border. Wagons bogged down in mud, horses died from exhaustion, food spoiled, sick soldiers filled field hospitals, dysentery spread through camps where sanitation was primitive. Desertion rates climbed as men calculated their chances and decided going home was wiser than dying for a pointless fort. Time worked against the Sultan, and all because of this cursed town that should have fallen in 2 days. By August 20th, the first signs of demoralization appeared in the Ottoman camp. Soldiers grumbled, "Why cannot the world's greatest army take a miserable fortress? What kind of commanders lead us? Are we being used properly?" Janissaries, accustomed to victories, lost comrades in fruitless assaults and began to doubt their commanders. This was dangerous. Ottoman military power rested on discipline and morale. When soldiers questioned leadership, when they lost faith in inevitable victory, the entire system became brittle. Ibrahim Pasha ordered intensified artillery bombardment, doubled assault frequency, applied all possible siege technologies. The Ottomans brought up siege towers, tall wooden structures on wheels from which walls could be stormed from above, bypassing breaches. These were 30 feet tall, mobile castles that rolled toward walls on heavy wheels, carrying dozens of soldiers who would pour onto the ramparts once the tower reached the fortifications. Defenders met them with fire, flaming arrows, boiling oil, anything that could ignite wood. Arquebuses loaded with incendiary mixtures, torches thrown from walls. Several towers burst into flames, turning into giant bonfires, burning dozens of attackers alive. Men trapped in burning towers jumped from heights, breaking legs and backs, then were shot or clubbed to death by defenders. The Ottomans tried to fill moats with fascines and sandbags to ease approach to walls, to create level pathways for assault columns. Defenders beat back these attempts with counterattacks, sorties, sudden strikes where garrison troops burst from gates in small groups, killed the work parties, set fire to the fascines, then retreated before Ottoman reserves could respond. These sorties were desperate, risky, often suicidal. But they kept the Ottomans off balance, disrupted their siege operations, bought precious hours and days. Jurišić understood. His men were at the limit. By August 25th, half the garrison was dead or wounded. Of the original 700 to 800 men, about 350 to 400 remained combat capable. The rest lay in improvised hospitals, houses converted to infirmaries where wounded groaned on straw pallets, where untrained women did what they could with primitive medicine, where men died from infections and blood loss and shock. Others were buried in mass graves inside the fortress, interred quickly without ceremony because there was no time for funerals. Kőszeg's walls were piles of ruins held together by desperation, grotesque approximations of fortifications that somehow still functioned. Ammunition was running out. Gunpowder was finishing, rationed to a few shots per man per assault. Lead for casting bullets was extracted from dismantled roofs, church windows, anywhere metal could be found. Food was almost gone, last reserves of grain, dried meat divided by ounces, watered wine, moldy bread. Defenders held on through sheer will, on pure force of spirit, knowing that one more serious assault meant the end. But Jurišić also knew something else. He had accomplished his mission. Almost 3 weeks the Ottoman army had trampled in place under Kőszeg. 3 weeks won for Europe. And then the Croatian nobleman decided on one last desperate trick: psychological warfare. According to legend, during one of the decisive assaults when defenders had almost no strength left and half the garrison was dead, Jurišić ordered all the city's bells rung and raised a cry. Women, children, everyone alive screamed and beat drums. The Turks, in confusion, retreated, thinking reinforcements had arrived to the city. It was pure bluff, masterful psychological manipulation. The defenders had nothing, no reinforcements, no reserves, no hope except the enemy's uncertainty. The city erupted in noise. Church bells clanged, people shouted, drums pounded. From outside, the cacophony sounded like an army arriving, like thousands of fresh troops pouring through gates, like relief forces smashing into Ottoman rear areas. And it worked. The Ottomans pulled back, shocked, demoralized, unsure. For an army that had conquered half the known world, this tiny fortress had become an incomprehensible nightmare, a place where all military logic broke down. On August 30th, 1532, grim silence reigned in the Ottoman camp. 25 days of fruitless assaults, thousands of dead and wounded janissaries, hundreds of tons of gunpowder expended in vain. The fortress still stood. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, greatest ruler of his time, conqueror of Belgrade and Rhodes, master of half the Mediterranean, could not take a miserable town defended by a handful of peasants. This was not just military failure, it was humiliation that could undermine the prestige of the entire empire. And the Sultan made a decision that changed European history. He would withdraw. Not in defeat, never admit defeat, but in pragmatic calculation that continuing the siege meant losing the entire campaign. On the morning of August 30th, Pargalı Ibrahim Pasha summoned Nikola Jurišić for negotiations. The Grand Vizier was an experienced diplomat and understood. Time worked against the Ottomans. The negotiations took place in Ibrahim Pasha's tent under Janissary guard. Jurišić came there wounded, exhausted, but unbroken. The vizier proposed a deal. Symbolic capitulation. The Ottoman flag would be raised on Kőszeg's walls for 1 day. The Sultan could claim the fortress had fallen. Defenders keep their lives, property, and honor. No reprisals, no looting. The Turks move on. Jurišić understood. This was the maximum achievable. The Croatian nobleman agreed to symbolic surrender with one condition. Ottoman troops do not enter the city. On August 30th, the crescent was raised on Kőszeg's walls, but Kőszeg remained unconquered. The next day, September 1st, 1532, the Ottoman army began withdrawal. 120,000 warriors turned around and headed back south. The march on Vienna was derailed. Instead of triumphal capture of the Habsburg capital, the Ottomans got 25 days of shame under the walls of a third-rate town. The consequences proved global. Having lost almost a month, the Ottomans lost strategic initiative. The following year, 1533, a peace treaty was concluded, which confirmed the status quo in Hungary. Ottoman expansion into Central Europe was stopped. 700 men without artillery stopped the world's most powerful army and saved Vienna. History loves paradoxes. One of the Christian world's greatest victories was won not by emperors with their armies, but by a Croatian nobleman with 700 craftsmen and peasants. 25 days of siege outweighed years of diplomacy and dozens of major battles. That is why Kőszeg remains in memory, as a reminder that in history, it is not always big battalions that win, but sometimes small fortresses with big hearts.